Okay, let's begin. Thank you all for joining us. The students, everybody, please shut off your laptops, your cell phones, or at least put them on silent. And please pay attention to our speaker who has come from Chicago to be with us from C.A.I.R, the Council on American Islamic Relations. So do take copious notes for your reaction papers. And this may be the only opportunity that you will have such a speaker. And the exposure is something that will be indelible, hopefully. Please don't worry about your children. The children are in the Mary Jane Cafe. They're just right next door. They're having fun. And irrespective of the fact it's called the Mary Jane Cafe, I promise you they're not getting high. Okay? They're not getting high on weed. They're not listening to Rastafarian music. But they may be watching Cheech and Chong specials, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. So it's been a very difficult election. Very acrimonious election, has pitted Americans against Americans and has forced them to choose their loyalty. Universal ID cards for Muslims, background checks, immigration problems. Muslim parents need to rehearse what they're going to say at airports. Muslim parents need to talk to their children about letting things go if they get accosted. So these are the challenges that Muslims face, and it is the most recent civil rights challenge of a community that is quite infant nowadays in America. So I hope that this will be an enriching experience for you, but also I hope that we are able to cultivate some empathy. A lot of the stuff that we learn in school we may forget, but cultivating empathy for the other, trying to reach out to the other, trying to experience the other is something that I hope that will be indelible that you will take away from this lecture. Our hearts grieve for the innocent victims who died in Egypt last Sunday. Innocent Christians who are worshiping on Palm Sunday, right? And now, having said that, it is a reality that most of the victims of ISIS are Muslims. And Bertrand Russell, who was a very famous British philosopher, he said that in order to cultivate empathy, that when you read a newspaper, you should try to replace the death of somebody else as your death. So, for instance, if you read in the newspaper that 20 Filipinos died today, replace Filipinos with Americans to see if it creates that same visceral response within you, right? That's how we cultivate empathy. So last year, there were 2 Titanics in the Mediterranean. 2 Titanics of innocent women and children that died trying to cross the ocean, cross the sea to get to Europe, and there's just nameless, faceless death. And I think about them, their plight and their pain, and how they clung to each other as the sea swallowed them in. Right? Can we cultivate empathy for them? Right? Cultivating empathy for Muslims, non-Muslims, or people of any faith. No, James Cameron is going to write a movie about them, make a movie. Celine Dion is not going to sing a song for them. They're just nameless, faceless death, unfortunately. Right? So try to cultivate empathy in these types of encounters. And on behalf of the Muslim Student Organization on campus, on behalf of the Diversity Center, on behalf of the Islamic Society of Greater Springfield, I'd like to welcome you as you stand in solidarity with us. And one of the co-sponsors of this particular event is the International Student Services, and I will ask Director Lane, Rick Lane, to introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to add a word of welcome on behalf of the university, and I'm glad you all made it, came out tonight and to hear our speaker. Especially happy to see my boss, our Vice Chancellor, Clarice Ford over there on the end, and students and members of various parts of our community. The Office of International Student Services is happy to be part of this program tonight and proud to make our contribution. I wrote down a few words about our speaker that I'd like to share with you. And I hope you don't mind if I read them, because otherwise I'll leave out something important. Ahmad Rehab is the Executive Director of the Council on American Islamic Relations of Chicago. He's a regular contributor to the Chicago Tribune and Chicago Public Radio, has been interviewed many times by newspaper, radio, and television journalists in the United States and around the world. He lectures regularly at university campuses in Chicago and across the nation. And Mr. Rehab is the founder of My Jihad Incorporated, a global PR and outreach campaign that seeks to take back Islam from extremists, both Muslim and anti-Muslim. Prior to joining C.A.I.R, C.A.I.R, in August of 2004, Mr. Rehab was a freelance speaker and writer, activist in fields of interfaith collaboration, education, and community outreach. And he served on former Illinois Governor Pat Quinn's Muslim Advisory Council, has worked tirelessly in support of refugee rights and resettlement efforts. I'm just going to refer you to his website because his biography just goes on and on and on, and I think you'll be impressed with what you read there, but also impressed with the work that's described on the website. So it's CAIRchicago.org. Go visit it. Learn more about our speaker tonight, Mr. Rehab.
Thank you, Director Lane. Thank you, Dr. Ali. And thank you to the Chancellor and Vice Chancellor and everyone else at the university who sponsored or co-sponsored to make this event possible. And last but not least, thank you, our dear audience members of students and families and citizens of Springfield, for taking time out of your evening to be with us. It is truly a pleasure for me to be here because I'm not often here. I think this is the first time, actually, that I'm speaking at this particular campus. I do speak at campuses around the country, so it's always nice to come back to a campus that's part of the University of Illinois system, of which I am a graduate myself. The topic that was assigned to me was, or is, American Muslims, Challenges and Opportunities in terms of the civil rights world in the Trump era. So I want to begin by going back not just a few years, but a few centuries to the founding of the United States of America, to set the scene. Because everything that we're seeing now and everything that we have seen really in our history has to be seen in one snapshot, and then to see the episodes of the same story developing. We need to understand the origins of the struggle. From the very beginning, even before the foundation of the United States, if you look at the Declaration of Independence that was yearning for a free United States, an independent United States, and you read that Declaration of Independence, you will find that it is indeed, in a way, a litany of social justice grievances that generations who were born and raised in the United States and began to coalesce around the American identity felt that they were being hard done by the crown, by the British forces, and that they were denied justice, socially, politically, economically. And the Declaration of Independence, one bullet point after another, was a cry out for justice. And in that cry for justice was also a proactive capturing of a set of values that later translated into our Constitution, that talked about equality, freedom, opportunity, the values that became known around the world as American values. So that's part of the positive birth of the United States. The values that we have till this day that we perhaps are more ideals than values. Sometimes we don't quite capture them in our day-to-day life. But these ideals are real and they're there. And I always talk about America as a tale of two Americas. So that's one. Now, in the same document, you'll find a reference to Indian savages in that very same document. So those values were great, but they didn't really apply to everyone. And of course, we know that there was a genocide that was committed against native tribes who preceded the European immigrants to call this land home. And we also know of the transatlantic slave trade at around the same time that came along with the European immigrants. That institution that systemized a form of dehumanization against a particular group of people. And those values that were mentioned, those lofty values, did not apply to that group either. To the contrary, between genocide and enslavement, they were somewhere else completely. The struggle of America is the struggle between those who want to widen that tent, that seed that was originally there. It's American, it's there. They want to widen the tent to include more people, and those who want to keep it narrow or narrow it still after it had widened. And you see that in many different episodes in our history, whether it is the American Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, and before that, all of the efforts of abolitionists to bring freedom to a sub-community of Americans and to render them equal to their brethren here in this land. Or whether later, after that was accomplished, after much blood, sweat, and tears, and we still had institutionalized racism and Jim Crow and things like that, and then there was a push for the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and before that in the 50s, there were leaders, American leaders of various backgrounds, led by African Americans who were centered in their own struggle, but from the Jewish community, the Christian community, the white community, pushing for equality and freedom, to widen the tent so that those values could apply to more people. And there was pushback from others to keep the tent narrow. And after that was accomplished, there were still voices and leaders elsewhere in America that wanted to turn back the clock. And then as we saw the influx of immigrants from various parts of the world coming into this land, we saw a certain trend of, at first, a sort of reluctance to accept them as equal, whether it was the Irish or the German or the Italian or the Jewish or the Eastern European immigrants or the Latino and thereafter South Asian and Arab immigrants. What xenophobia and racism, and in our case Islamophobia, that we see today and have seen in the past few years and decades has to be seen within that larger history, that it wasn't just born for us, it wasn't just created for us, it existed already, it just took a new shape, a new flavor. It might be difficult for us today to understand that the Irish, who today are mayors and governors and heads of police forces and fire departments and educators, and indeed presidents like Kennedy and Reagan. Once upon a time, if you were Irish, you had to look around your shoulder. You had to think twice before you applied to a position, because in many places there were signs that said Irish need not apply, or no dogs or Irish allowed. Likewise with Italians and Jewish immigrants and all the other groups I mentioned. And it took a generation or two, it took some pushback, some fighting, some growing up, some integration for that to sort of dissipate away over time. But then, all too quickly, it rears its ugly head again in the form of xenophobia against a new community, and other community. And so it's very important for me to mention to you, as a civil rights activist who is centered in the Muslim experience in America, who fights against Islamophobia, that for me, I don't see this struggle as coming out of nowhere, nor do I see the end of it as simply, okay, my community's fine, we've shed the yoke of Islamophobia, we're done. But we remember and remind ourselves that we don't want this to happen to the next group either. That our fight will continue so long as anyone faces any form of bigotry or hatred or discrimination simply because of who they are, particularly where they were born or what religion they have or what color skin they have, so on and so forth. But when I look at the two approaches that some young people have to this history, and I note the two extremes, I try to push back and say, stay away from the extremes and realize that balance is the key to all success. On one extreme, you have those that look at the genocide and the racism and those waves of discrimination that followed waves of immigrants to say America was born evil, continues to be evil. I will not honor America. I will not stand for its flag. I will be a rebel, a revolutionary, whatever. On the other hand, you have those that have all of these negative experiences of large communities like Native Americans and African Americans and immigrants squarely in their blind spot. And all they see is the lofty ideals from day one, and they glorify glorify. There's the flapping eagle, the waving flag, and don't you dare say a word about any negative history. And so that's on the other extreme. I stand in a place in which my faith teaches me that when I move into something like a new home, or really when I look at any entity in the world, I see what is good and I make it better, and I see what is bad and I make it less bad. I acknowledge both the successes and the failures, the challenges and the opportunities. I have a holistic look at things. They're not necessarily contradicting one another in that it has to be one or the other. In our own lives, if you were to audit your own person and your personal life, you will find episodes of your life that you're proud of and others that you would want to do over again. There are aspects of your personality that you feel are great and aspects that you feel you need work on. We need to look at our country the same way. We don't need to buckle down in one corner and see the world through black and white, through extremes. We need to be able to appreciate the shades of gray, so long as we understand that the values are clear, and that where the values existed, we acknowledge that, and again, we make them better and stronger. But where they didn't, we acknowledge that as well, and we put them there. We bring them in. Take what's bad and make it good. Take what's good and make it better. That is the name of the struggle. Realizing that all of us are affected when these values are not universal for all Americans. Don't think that any particular person or community is in a safe zone if these values are denied universally to all Americans. Because sooner or later, someone's going to come along and just flip the direction. So long as the negativity is there, it's there. The direction can go in any which way. So it's important that we take it from the root out, that we no longer allow for xenophobia or racism or bigotry to be a part of our lexicon, that we don't need to fear the other. We need to understand that we have so much more in common. Now, in terms of the work that we do, the civil rights work, which is rooted in that history and that context, C.A.I.R Chicago, or the Council on American Islamic Relations in Chicago, is very much an American story. I wasn't born a civil rights activist. I wasn't trained as one either. I began my career as a student like you, studying psychology and pre-medicine, then changed my mind about wanting to be a doctor and didn't know what to do at first, and then decided to get into software engineering, which I did, and completed my master's at DePaul University in Chicago, and then worked as a consultant for a Fortune 500 company. And in my own mind, I would climb up the corporate ladder and get somewhere in life, and that was, I'd volunteer here and there and do good work as much as I can, but I never really envisioned myself being a civil rights activist. When 9/11 happened, the year 2001, a couple of years later, I had become a little bit unhappy with the response in my own community. I felt that bigotry was on the rise, there was bullying happening from the playground all the way to people at work, and that there weren't sufficient voices injecting the truth and the reality of who we are as Muslims, what our faith represents, and pushing back against the stereotypes and biases that were very rampant in the media and elsewhere. And I was challenged to do something about it. And at that time, we had some organizations, but it was really at that time that people of my generation began to enter into leadership positions to try to bring an American flavor to the work, because a lot of the work was being done by immigrants who, God bless them, like I mentioned earlier in a talk that we had here, they had come here not speaking the language, working low-level paying jobs, but moved up the social ladder very quickly, learned the language, went to school, got their degrees, built their homes, and also mosques and centers. But there was always a glass ceiling in terms of what they could achieve. The language being foreign, the accent being thick, the cultural lexicon not quite being there. And so sometimes when we had the luxury of having them on television, which wasn't very frequent, because oftentimes you had experts who had nothing to do with our community speaking on our behalf, but where you had the odd, lucky, time or another when somebody actually would be invited to talk, they wouldn't quite carry the message forward, and you'd find that the opponent would take full advantage of that to cast that shadow of foreignness even stronger on the person who was trying to explain what our community was about. So we had, I believe at the time, and I still believe, a responsibility to step up and build institutions through which we could connect with our fellow Americans, not just in the English language, but in the cultural language that was required, not to invent anything or to whitewash anything, but to simply reflect the reality of who we are on a daily basis, which just simply was not understood and not common knowledge. So C.A.I.R Chicago was one of many organizations that was created around the time to do just that. And we focused on civil rights because we understood that this wasn't about religion, really. I mean, let's face it, most Americans know little about their own religious books, let alone ours. And I thought, and still think, that it would have been foolish for us to believe that a way to fight Islamophobia is to stand up in places like this and begin to explain the Quran and the Sunnah and all these religious concepts to people. Because that's not the root of bigotry. That's not the root of hate. It has nothing to do with religious texts. Like I said, most people don't even know their own, let alone mine. It had to do with otherization. It had to do with, seeing us as an other, as the they, not the we. It had to do with certain biases, certain exotic perceptions of who a Muslim is that was just rooted in a lack of fact, lack of information. For example, there was a lack of acknowledgement of the true diversity that exists within the Muslim sphere. When you say Muslim, people thought of deserts, for example. But Islam is just as much at home in places like China and the mountains of Pakistan and, the lush jungles of Africa and other parts of the geography of the world as the desert. Not to mention that Christianity and Judaism are as much rooted in that perception of the desert, if you want to go there, as Islam. All the prophets and Jesus Christ and everyone else coming from that same part of the world, not exactly from the islands of the UK. But again, it wasn't about actual religion, it was about perception. Ethnically speaking, as I mentioned also in a talk earlier, the diversity in our community is unmatched in terms of nationality, in terms of languages spoken. So it was very odd to keep seeing the same stereotypical representations that denied 90% of Muslims their realities. And that was the limitation of what a Muslim was. Even worse than that, after 9/11, Muslim became limited in terms of the rhetoric, the public rhetoric, to a sliver of a percent. Those who are terrorists, those who are radical, and the support networks that they have. And every time I, as an American Muslim sitting at my kitchen table, would watch television and hear the word Islam or Muslim pop up, it almost always uniquely and exclusively popped up in that context of terrorism, radicalization, as if we had nothing else going on. And again, we're talking about 0.0001%. Everything else denied. That became difficult. And it became not just about saying we're not terrorists, because that's actually a weak message. It goes without saying. But it became about saying who we are, what we are, which in a nutshell is you. In a nutshell, it is basically humanity. The diversity of humanity is reflected in the diversity of Islam, with its good and bad. But it takes a certain effort, whether it's religiously motivated or politically motivated, to paint it as something exotic and unique. And that goes for any form of discrimination or bigotry, right? So we focused on that message. Education had to be a part of our work. And by education, it meant public lectures and discussions and social media, but also broadcast media, which we began to make a concentrated effort to be a part of. We wanted to be sitting at the table of conversations, of dialogue, locally and nationally. Growing up, the two options I had watching a debate on Islam or Muslims was to have one side that represented, an Islamophobic position, and the other side, a really Islamophobic position. And those were the two sides of the debate. And I had to sort of retire myself to that. And many in our community did. Many in our community began to develop the defeatist conclusions that the media hated Islam. That's something I heard, and I'm sure some Muslims here heard growing up. The media hates Islam. The media hates Muslims, as if the media itself is a monolith. And for a while, we bought into that somehow there is some conspiracy in the broadcast media, that everybody got together and said, that's one group we don't like. But as we thought about it, and again, outside of the box, because everything had to be now outside of the box, it dawned upon us that when you talk about the media, you're talking about people. And those people are not one group of people. They cannot possibly agree on anything, let alone this, or everything, let alone this. You're talking about Italian producers, Christian producers, Jewish producers, African American producers, white producers, this, and the other. So it really didn't quite fly. So we began to look inwards. What is it that we weren't doing? And we began to professionalize, and that's a key word for us, our entire operation, from the volunteer efforts that our community had once upon a time into paid, compensated, corporate style, but really non-for-profit spirit type of organizations. And that's what C.A.I.R Chicago was all about. For me, 50% of the motivation in creating this organization was the subject matter, in this case civil rights. The other 50% had to do with the style and the administration and the logistics. I just wanted to bring a professional representative organization to the fore within the Muslim community experience, which prior did not quite exist, at least in the Chicagoland area. You had organizations in which there were 24 board members and 1 or less staff members. So now we had people who were trained and paid and staffed to work full-time to do this type of work. And part of it was to build relationships with producers and anchors and journalists and broadcasters in order to let them know, A, that we're available, and B, that we know our stuff. And then through trial and error, through time and again, get them to understand that this is a place to go to when you want to discuss issues pertaining to the Muslim community. And that worked very, very well, to the point where today we are, I believe, indispensable to anybody in the Chicagoland media who wants to report on Islam and Muslims. And sometimes we think we've gone too far and we have to turn down interviews and things like that because it's off the hook. But it's important to be placed in this place where you can represent your community at the places of mass media dissemination. As important as face-to-face conversations are, if you want to hit numbers, you need to be able to work with media. So we began to, as we went into the mosques and had conversations with our own community, we began to explain, look, you need to dispense of this idea that there is some conspiracy against us. It's not true. And at first I'd get a look like, wait, you're representing us. How come you're saying that? Because it's true. It's true that there isn't a conspiracy. We need to do work. There might be, of course, people who are predisposed to bias who work in the media, right? But they're at the individual level. You can't say the industry has a bias. You can't say that about anything of a large group of people. So what component of this equation falls on us that we haven't quite fulfilled? Let's begin with that. And once we have, then let's start to look at where the biases exist on an individual level and push back. And so we went in that direction. Everything worked fine. Then we started to, at the same time, also invest in legal representation. Legal representation is very important for us because the consequences of bias and misrepresentation and the dissemination of stereotypes causes average people sometimes to actually discriminate or hurt someone based on a misperception in their mind. I don't want to hire this person. And without subliminally, they have in their mind projections of what that person represents. I don't want this person to rent in my building. This person did something that any other person might have done, I would have let go, but no. The fact that this person is a Muslim or in a hijab or has a beard, now suddenly I'm bringing down the axe and they're fired. So where there was discrimination that was rooted in religious bias, we help Muslims free of charge to fight back. Now it's important to say, A, that not every person who came to us or comes to us has to be a Muslim. Because it isn't about being Muslim, it is about what you are perceived to be by the offender. So if a Sikh individual. Sikh being their own religion. If you're not familiar with Sikhs, the men wear turbans for religious reasons. They were at the brunt of Islamophobia left and right after 9/11, even though they're not even Muslim. Now, we're not going to turn them away and say you're not Muslim. They're targeted as Muslims. We're going to defend them as if they were Muslim, acknowledging that they're not and embracing them for who they are. Likewise with people who tend to look Middle Eastern but maybe Christian. Some Syrians, some Lebanese, some Egyptians. We saw many cases of discrimination in which the offender targeted them through the lens of Islamophobia. Even though they're not Muslim, we take on their case. So it's whether you have Islam imputed upon you and not just whether you're a Muslim that makes you the domain of our work. Secondly, in terms of the offending act, it has to do with religious bias. So if a Muslim comes to me and says, look, I didn't get this license or this permit for my business, we're not just going to help them just because they're Muslim and they were denied an opportunity. We're going to investigate whether the reasons behind it had to do with religious discrimination. If they had to do with any other form of bias, including personal bias, let's say this particular government agent didn't like this particular Muslim, that's not a case we take. But if it had to do with actual motivations of religious bias and hate and bigotry, then that's something we take. So we're very clear about our scope, and we began to work pro bono, going back to our community for charitable giving to 100% fund this work. Then education, conferences, meetings, interfaith was another part of the work. And lastly, government relations, because we wanted to be able to influence how policies are created that affect our community. As we matured, we understood that we could not work in a bubble. We understood from the beginning that that was the case. But now that our resources were growing, we had to reach out and work in alliances and coalitions. And so immigrant coalitions, coalitions that involve minorities, interfaith coalitions, so on and so forth. The challenge was difficult in the Bush years, in the Obama years. Towards the end, as the elections, the last cycle of presidential elections were upon us, and you may recall from the primaries and the speeches that were given by candidates and the rhetoric therein, there was a lot of Islamophobia. And we heard from Donald Trump, who later became president, but even as a candidate, ideas that really shook our community to the core. Things like a Muslim ban. Things like Muslim registry. And we heard those ideas being discussed in the mainstream media as if they were plausible. There was actual discussion of these, in our opinion, flippant, outrageous, sensational ideas. We saw respectable people with a straight face going back and forth about those types of policies. Truth be told, more often than not, you had people pushing back and raising eyebrows, but still the fact that it was a public discussion really chilled our community, that this was actually possible. Now, of course, going back to how we started, we know that it actually happened in our history. And we know that the Japanese were interned during World War II. And for those who believe it can never happen again, we need to understand that in the ordinary circumstances it is far-fetched, but if there is a certain trigger that puts us in extraordinary times, then don't bet your bottom dollar on it, that it's out of the question. One being World War II, that was an extraordinary event, and Pearl Harbor, the first time the United States was ever attacked by the Air Force of a foreign military. So let's say in the future, God forbid, there is another large terrorist attack. Yes, while today, where we're at now, I would say that the Muslim registry and Muslim internment camps are very far-fetched. I can't totally say that it's out of the question should such an act happen, especially if the accompanying public rhetoric puts the emphasis on the Muslim community and Islam as being somehow complicit in the act as a whole. Then it's not out of the question. So we can't quite, and I warn people that who use the line, oh, it's out of the question, it's far-fetched, and sort of sit back, that there are circumstances in which it may be in the question. And we hope those circumstances never happen, for their own sake. We don't want any attacks against our country, but also because we can't guarantee that should something happen, it would be out of the question. The Muslim ban, that's something that didn't even require such an attack. One of the early policies, one of the early executive orders that President Trump signed was what we believe was a Muslim ban, that he called a travel ban, or those in his administration called a travel ban, that targeted, at the time, the first travel ban, as you may know, 7 Muslim countries: Iran, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Sudan, and Somalia. And that said no to Syrian refugees, said no to other refugees for a period of time, and was so unclear and so hasty and so messy that it wasn't clear to most people, including those who were enforcing it, whether American citizens who are Muslim are excluded or whether green card holders were excluded. And you saw in the early days of that decree, people who were in the air at the time of its signing be denied entry once they arrived at American airports. And it included, for example, a woman in Chicago who had a 5-year multiple re-entry visa she's from Syria, but she was traveling in from Saudi Arabia, where she had lived for many years. And this visa was issued by a U.S. embassy. It was a valid visa. She had used it multiple times. She had never overstayed any of those times. She had a return ticket. She had clear proof, as was presented in the interview at the embassy, of her ties to her home country, questions that they ask you. And she had a letter from a cancer institute in the United States clearly delineating the reason for her visit, that her mom had just undergone cancer surgery and she was here to be with her. This woman, having traveled across the ocean, and you know how difficult that can be, with your baggage and you're waiting and your mom is in the hospital and you're counting the hours and the minutes and the seconds, and finally you arrive at your destination, you're tired mentally and physically. And she was met by a crew of officers who took her into primary, then secondary questioning, and this lasted for hours, and she didn't understand why. And the simple answer was she was a Muslim. She was on the list of those countries. She had done nothing. There was nothing in her profile. Now, those who say, oh, it's a national security initiative, there was nothing mentioned in terms of this particular person. And I use her as one example. You can multiply that by thousands and you can look at the bigger picture. But just to look at a face and a name of a certain human being who's caught in this web, you have an individual that nothing, no red flags ever came out of her particular profile. Nobody who talked to her said, you have done X, Y, or Z, and as a result, we're interested in you. This was all about you were born in Syria. That's it. That's all it took. And you had other examples. The Iranian student who was doing his PhD at Princeton went back home to visit his family, denied re-entry. The Iranian filmmaker who was invited by the Academy out in California, nominated for Best Foreign Film for the second time. He won the first time. He happened to win the second time as well, but he actually didn't come to the United States, first as a result of the ban, but then secondly when the ban was stayed by the courts. He refused in principle to come because of all the other people who were still banned. But he was denied entry to receive an award that we had given him before. Now, these are human stories of people who are treated like criminals, who are inconvenienced, because of a philosophy that, in order to make you feel safe, we're going to have this wide dragnet. And supposedly, you will feel safe. Now, the problem with that is, set aside the moral and the human problems with this policy. The security problems are even worse. They do nothing for safety, because real security does not cast a wide dragnet and then you hope to catch what you're looking to catch. Rather, it laser beams on profiles based on actions, not based on identities, not based on where you're born, not based on your religion, not based on your skin color, but based on what you've done, based on what's on your record, in your history, your associations, your relationships. That's what intelligence communities do. And in rolling out this policy, it was a lazy way to essentially excuse and to no longer put the emphasis on this hard work, but instead in this catch-all. No security involved in that. Now, the courts, and this is something that's important for us to know, we have this system of checks and balances, and Americans who were affected by this, and it wasn't just Muslims or Arabs or people from those countries, but it was universities like this who were concerned that they would be denied students who were perfectly valid to come and study here, but would be denied by virtue of this draconian policy. Hospitals that would be missing the opportunity to deal with patients that may come here for medical reasons. And indeed, these are the types of people, looking at the track record and the data that we have, the type of people that came from those countries came for those reasons, medical reasons, for weddings, for funerals, for to meet with loved ones and then return again, for business opportunities, for education, so on and so forth. And where a person comes in for other reasons, there are very, very strong ways for us through security measures to be able to tell. 0 fatal attacks have occurred as a result of immigration, whether as refugees or immigrants from any of those 7 countries. 0. And I was talking to Dr. Robert Pape at the University of Chicago, who is a leading scholar and scientist studying terrorism and particularly ISIS. And he shared with me his most recent results, in which he showed me that the overwhelming majority of those who are involved with ISIS, and by that we mean 3 things: either people who have committed acts, people who have traveled to places where ISIS is functional, or abettors of either group, those who have aided either group. When you look at that domain of people, you find that they were radicalized online in the United States. Very, very few came radicalized from somewhere else. So we're not shutting down the threat at the airport if we're not dealing with it online, because that's where it's coming from. So there is that sense of essentially bait and switch. It was designed simply to make people feel safe, not to actually make people safe, while turning a blind eye to the civil rights and human rights involved in such a draconian measure. So the courts said that after civil rights communities fought back, they said, this doesn't make sense, this is religious discrimination, and it was stayed. There was a second attempt. They dropped one country, Iraq, because there were complaints that we get a lot of Iraqis who were helping us in the war on terror. And they took out the green card holders, and they put the Syrians with the other refugees. So basically, they were now so there was no discrimination in that sense. And they took out language they had to do in the original draft, or in the original policy, in the original executive order, that differentiated between Christian and Muslim refugees. Now, there wasn't that religious language. And again, multiple federal judges in multiple states ruled after complaints from civil rights communities and their clients that these were unconstitutional. Now, there's still a chance for them to appeal and to take it all the way to the Supreme Court, where a 5th conservative judge was just confirmed. So the fight is not over on the travel ban. But the culture behind the travel ban and what it is out to do is more important than the result of the travel ban. That's what I want you to think about. And it troubles me as an American more than as a Muslim, because as an American, I am concerned for the safety and security of this country, just like anybody else. It is my home too. If something were to happen as a result of global terrorism, and I happen to be in one of those buildings, it's not going to, circumvent me as the Muslim or my children. So we want a safe country, a secure country, not just for me and my family, but I want it for everyone because I care about people as a good human. But also, I don't want a country in which we can be played by gimmicky politics as an American. I don't want my intelligence to be insulted. I don't want to be told that this is for my security when indeed it is for something completely different. And that's where we need to be more alert, more engaged, and more understanding of the issues at play. Right after Trump was elected, one of the first meetings I had was at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. I used to sit on their board. It is a large coalition of various immigrant groups, and it works to advocate for the rights of immigrants, including those who are undocumented. And I sat with many of my Latino brothers and sisters, Latina brothers and sisters as well, and one woman was in tears. And she had this palpable fear that should she go to work, she may not come back to see her daughter because she could be arrested. And her daughter had that real fear as well, that she may not see her mother in the afternoon. The rhetoric and the policies that were suggested lead them to believe so. And we don't think of the human consequences. We think of these things as written on paper and discussed on television, but how they affect real people, the empathy that Dr. Ali talked about, doesn't seem to be part of that debate quite yet. And we need to inject it into the debate. We need to talk, we need to center communities who are affected. And again, the gimmicky aspect of things. The wall, for example. We don't ask whether it is actually effective from a national security standpoint. Set aside, again, all of the things that civil rights activists like me may be interested in, but let's actually take them for their word and assess the security integrity of the idea. People can scale walls, and they do so all the time. People can build tunnels, and they do so all the time. So this very expensive multi-million dollar 20, 30, 40 billion, according to which report you read, is again designed to make a statement, designed to set a certain emotion and certain culture. It isn't about security. And we have to inject that into the debate. We have to actually ask whether what is being declared and the reasons for the declaration, whether they are actually true. Not just whether they hurt us or not, because civil rights people and liberal, voices, they tend to just focus on, it hurts. Well, I don't want to dismiss the hurt, but let's also engage in an intellectual discussion and debate and assess things for the reasons that they were declared for, because you'll find a lot of weaknesses there as well. So, what is the Muslim community feeling right now? What is happening with the Muslim community or other minority communities as a result of this election? Well, we all know that the nation is very polarized, and it wasn't just polarized as a result of this election. It was polarized under Obama's tenure as well. We failed to have a national consensus on some of the key issues affecting us, including healthcare. We hear from very loud, very sharp, very extreme, really, because direction voices on things like healthcare. And there doesn't seem to be interest even in trying to meet middle way, trying to figure things out for the common good. Instead, there seems to be an opportunity for each side to bait the other as being the anti-American or the extremist or the overly liberal or the overly right-wing, to score political points, to serve election cycles, rather than to center the American people in their interests and say, look, other countries have figured it out. Other countries have a robust healthcare system that is not tanking the economy, but is still providing decent healthcare for everyone. What are they doing differently? Are they richer than us? The answer is no. Are they spending money in a better way? The answer is yes. But that's not the discussion on healthcare, much as it dominates the airwaves. That isn't the substance of the discussion. The discussion remains a sensational one of pointing fingers and lobbying shots across the aisle, and it works well for everyone. It works well for Democrats trying to sink Republicans in the next election, for Republicans trying to sink Democrats in the next election, and the platform that they're using, the media, for ratings. And we're the losers in this equation because there isn't an honest, substantive debate on the issue. It is the same with security, and Muslims may be today's whipping boy or fall boy, someone else may be tomorrow. Latinos are sometimes, African Americans, someone else. It comes down to, other than what I talked about, the small tent versus the white tent, expanding the tent. Other than that, it comes down to whether we accept gimmicks as a way of doing politics or we insist in an honest, genuine, meaningful debate on the issues. That's a whole different story than the other story we mentioned. That is where much of my anger remains. And I know it's outside the fold of discrimination and bigotry and civil rights, but it does play into it. when we allow gimmicky politics to continue. Much of the rallies that we heard that Trump was at, a lot of these policies were not even, there were no details to these policies. This wasn't about solutions. This was about triggering an emotion. When we heard from other candidates, so as not to single one candidate out, we heard, again, playing to fears of bigotry, playing to an emotion, rather than actually setting forth an agenda to solve problems. It reminds me of what we have in our general pop culture that has really invaded all aspects of our lives. This is just one example, but if you think to the contracts that we sign, all of the things that are meant to attract you into the contract are this big. And of all the things that matter to you and your rights are this small. We've accepted this culture as normal. So that when you finally realize that you've been hard done and you want a little justice for yourself, you're faced with this contract, you didn't read this little print down here that says you can't do that. You can't fend for yourself. You're screwed officially by your own signature. It's the same thing with those medical ads. The smiling faces and the flying butterflies and the flowers and everything else. And then when it comes to what this medicine can actually do for you, it's this really fast-playing voice that is hard for you to even decipher what they're saying. And again, that's perfectly legal, perfectly okay. It's business. It's good marketing. How long are we going to continue as an American people to be just sitting down, this lame duck, this sitting duck, waiting for someone to pluck at it and eat at it? Politics is the same way today. We're seen as basically this plump duck that every party wants at its table. And sometimes we're played against one another as a result. And we fall for it. The divisiveness is real. Polarization is real. And we think that we're actually helping when we prolong this process. Does anybody who is a blue-collar, hard-working, white Christian American in the Appalachians really think that the Muslim immigrant in New York or somewhere else is the root of their problems in life? There are politicians that want them to believe that. Or the Mexican worker. As opposed to the lack of focus on investing in education and vocational training and fair trade deals and cutting the fat from all of the legal proceedings that, again, are just so much part of our interaction that nobody can do anything anymore. A doctor can't heal. A doctor is afraid to tell you what you got. You go to another country and they figure it out. The prognosis is fast. Here, we don't know. We're not sure. We can't tell. And the person dies next week because they're afraid of being sued. We don't have a system that's human-centered. We have a system that is centered around rules and regulations that are meant to protect us from each other because the assumption is we're going to attack one another. The empathy isn't part. You can't build a true civilization. You can't build a true cohesive society devoid of that. We can try, and it's been working to a degree. How long, how well, I can't tell you. But I want to sound the alarm because I don't think it can be sustained forever. And we're seeing now the fault lines of this system. The system that's built, again, through protections rather than through empathy. Through putting up your guard and defensiveness rather than through actually understanding and meshing with one another. I understand that we're a nation of immigrants. I understand that we didn't have a head start like other nations. We came from different places with different religions and different shades of skin and different cultural perspectives. And it's really amazing that we've gotten this far, given how diverse we are. It's quite an accomplishment. Again, put this in the column of American greatness, but don't forget, there's another column. It's a tale of two Americas. There are challenges that come with that. And I don't think we have quite had the good so that we pat ourselves on the back for yet. The true leadership yet that says bigotry, hate, divisiveness, discrimination, Islamophobia is all smokescreen and mirrors. They play people against each other and no one benefits from this. No one. Should bigotry win? Show me an actual human who wins with it as a result. It's never happened. The challenge is our collective challenge. And this dialogue and other dialogue that open up ideas and open up our minds and our hearts to each other, to understand that we are looking in the mirror, that whether you are of the majority, whatever that means, or a minority, you're really the same basic human being. That most people who are sane, functional people, they do want safety, they do want security, they want prosperity, they want opportunity for themselves. And that should be our starting point for everyone. We overemphasize difference. Even when we're having conversations about getting together, we overemphasize the differences. They're not that strong, they're not that real. The commonalities are much stronger and much more real. It's like we're afraid to acknowledge that. But as someone who came from a place that was relatively homogeneous in the early years of my life, which is Egypt, to a place that's extremely diverse and heterogeneous like America, and I recall consciously the journey between being in this mindset to being in the current mindset, I can tell you that the more you interact with other people, the more you realize we are all the same. I was just at a Passover the other day. Jewish attorney is a friend of mine who helped us, the Muslim community, in the early days of the travel ban at the airport when people were descending on that airport, and that's part of the good story of America still. The protests, but also the lawyers that were coming in and helping people with signs that said, "I'm an attorney, how can I help you?" And knowing that some people may not speak the language as visitors, they were looking at people's expressions to try to determine whom they can help free. That's the kind of empathy that was there. He was one of them. And attending his religious celebration, a different religion from mine, some commonalities. We believe in Moses. We believe in the story of the Passover. It's in our scriptures as well. But really what I saw was my family with just some minor differences, the exterior. But really the same kind of family lifestyle, the same kind of spirituality. And likewise with my Christian friends when I visit them and spend time with their families. So the question that we're always asked that assumes that Muslims come from a different place as humans. We need to retire those questions. You look at a woman wearing the hijab and you make all sorts of assumptions. She's so different. She comes from such a different place, a different mentality, a different consciousness. You're wasting your time on hers. And then we have to spend time educating and saying, oh, this is just, it's like a skirt, but it's like a blouse, just an item that you wear on your body. Since when does a particular skirt or a particular, jacket define someone in their entirety, becomes them? We just need to think a little wiser about those types of things and begin with the understanding that we have much more in common and then move forward with that confidence. So with that, I thank you very much, and I turn it back to you. Thank you. So I believe for the next half hour, we'll be doing questions and answers. So feel free to just raise your hand and speak loudly, and I'll be happy to answer your question. Is everybody tired, or did I just cover everything imaginable? Go ahead.
Please don't hesitate. Nothing is out of bounds. So.
Assalamu alaikum. So, as someone advocating civil rights, as an American for Americans, who grew up in another country, who came to America, and I'm sure you're helping all types of people, do you ever feel any personal, have you ever been insulted or backlash about your heritage that makes your job difficult, or that, obstacles that other people who work in community roles that help different people of different races every day,
that see those obstacles? Do you have any advice for them, or can you recommend any? How do you deal with it?
A lot of the cases we deal with have a strong human component. So we have attorneys that are trained to look at the legal case and that can be built around it. We don't dismiss the fact that it's difficult for someone to go through the traumatic experience of being targeted for something they never did. To be vilified, even though they may be the nicest people trying to be the nice, doing nice things every day. And still, they're vilified by others, talked down to, insulted, fired, abused, etc. This leaves a certain trauma that people who didn't go through that experience may not understand. And so we spend time to empower and try to bring back a sense of confidence and a sense of you're not guilty just because of how you look or what you believe or where you're from. Don't for a second, because colonization, before it happens physically and materialistically, it happens mentally and emotionally. And you need to believe. African Americans for a long time dealt with this when they were told that they were not beautiful, when they were told that their hair was ugly, etc. And there was this movement to bring back, essentially black confidence and to understand that what you have is beautiful. That was as important as changing the laws. That was as important as removing, the unsaid laws as well. Jim Crow, for example. So we focus on that. Now, I know a little bit about that. I can't say that I was targeted in the way that, my religion or my race, but I did undergo bullying in high school, being the new kid in this school that was, everybody was friends, they grew up together, they're all of the same, race and religion, and I was really an odd one out. So I remember that experience, and, I was able to get by, I was able to stand up for myself and all of that. But I remember how bad it made you feel, because you took it home. Like, it wasn't just, and then when you went to school the next day, you dreaded the experience. And people didn't realize that. They just see you and they think you're okay. So that is my single most motivator for doing the work that I do. People tell me, like, who motivated you? And the answer is, it's something that, I can't say it's a person that did something great, it was something bad that happened. Bullying. I just hate bullying. At any level, right? If you bully someone for their religion, which happens, or if you bully someone because of their physical appearance, their height, their weight, their disability, any reason whatsoever. I just happened to focus on the one that I felt affected my community. I had to start somewhere. I wanted to start at home, if you will.
Relatedly, do you, I think Ahmar's question perhaps is, have you experienced any backlash from fellow Muslims who say, why are you representing a Sikh? Why are you representing a Christian Arab? You should be representing one of us type of approach.
No. Maybe 30, 40 years ago. But by the time we got started, I think our community had matured enough and had understood the diversity that we have here, and also understood that from our own religious teachings, and this is the point I stress the most, and that's why it's hard for anyone to argue against it. I give khutbahs or sermons at the mosque, and I use religious values to justify the work I do, because I believe they're rooted in those Islamic values, that you stand up for justice regardless of the identity, not just of the victim, but of the perpetrator. Regardless of who is committing the injustice, let's say it's someone that you know. Let's say it's someone who is Muslim. That shouldn't stop you. Let alone the victim's identity, if they're Muslim or non-Muslim, if they're a friend or a foe. We're told to stand up for justice even if the victim is a foe, and against injustice even if the perpetrator is a friend. The language in the Quran, even if it's your own father. So it shouldn't matter at all, those identities. Of course, we have a logistical limitation given the resources, so we have to have a mission, and it's focused on Islamophobia, but we stand in alliance with all forms of justice against any form of discrimination. Yes?
Just have a couple general questions right there, because I hear a lot of subjectivity. in the presentation when you talk about feelings. And, you know, as well as I do, facts doesn't care about feelings. When you start talking about profiling, okay, it is, okay, let's take academia, where you have a population that you look at, then you also do a sample methodology, then you come up with a result. So how does playing identity politics by saying that we have Muslim phobia or the African American as a whole, and how do you speak for groups versus drilling down to each specific incident? Because we can say, yeah, there has been discrimination, but there has also been explosives. There has been African Americans shot by law enforcement, but there also have been African American on African American crime. So to have that intellectual discussion, do you feel that we should be more objective and pinpoint situations to call forums from each side to get, you know, better serve our community when we bring the scholars out instead of blanketing entire groups of people?
Well, definitely. And in laundry listing, sort of speak, the various communities that have been affected by some of the policies and rhetoric during the Trump campaign and thereafter, these are issues that we're working on currently, based on objective standards. And even before that, any of the social or civil rights issues that we're working on, social justice or civil rights issues, are based on facts and incidents. Like I mentioned earlier, we don't, for example, take a case if the person reporting it is a Muslim who thinks they've been hard done and they're Muslim, so they shouldn't be. No, we focus on whether the intent was discrimination because we're actually fighting discrimination. We're not fighting just to protect Muslims, period. We're not just the Muslim, bodyguard, right? We're against discrimination. We happen to focus on a particular community because of limited resources, but we ally with others working in other directions, and we center them. So to your point, when we talk about police brutality on the streets, we coalesce with our African American allies, having them be the center, centering them and their voices, and they take the lead, we follow, because they're experts on the issue. We learn from them, and then we reverberate the message to make it stronger, and we expect the same with other groups that work with us. Same thing when it comes to Latinos or any other group, anti-Semitism, and we fight that. So that's the beauty of working in alliances, is that the relationship is such that the person from the community, the person who's experienced it and who studies it and who has the objective standards and who also understands the subjective feelings, leads the conversation. We want to avoid what I call the Lawrence of Arabia syndrome, where somebody sails in as sort of the savior for someone else's community just because they're standing with them. But in reality, they tend to miss all sorts of facts and emotions and nuances. And that happens when you don't respect the community enough to respect that it has leaders that you need to listen to. But yeah, it comes down to facts, it comes down to statistics, it comes down to... My main message, for example, in saying that you cannot conflate terrorists with Muslims, even though I acknowledge that Muslims do commit acts of terror, is that statistically and objectively, to conflate the two is ridiculous when you consider that 0.0004% of Muslims, to be exact, commit acts of terror. And the 99 point, you name it, don't. But then where are we in the media? Where are we in pop culture? Where are we in policy conversations? Where are we in the social imagination other than this tiny percent, right? So yeah, it has to do with facts, it has to do with objectivity, and that's the strong point. I talk about emotion because that's something maybe we're accused of not doing enough of understanding that there's a real human component here. It's not just about studies and numbers. But in doing so, I definitely don't want to send the message that there aren't facts and figures and statistics and data and objectivity. Again, it's all about the balance. Yeah.
So being all Americans, would you agree that the appropriate approach should be the education of constitutional rights, where even though we're pursuing, there was something called blind neglect. As a black American, okay, what discrimination was where people was identifying disparate treatment. So instead of treating blacks fairly, what they did is they filled the class. And they called this thing called minority, Okay, so now blacks are a minority, and single white female is a minority, and now transgender is a minority. Now homosexuals are minorities. So that's called blind neglect, because you can't really get disparate treatment out of any one class by grouping people with identity politics. Now, as a black American who supported Trump, I didn't support the person, I supported the person that was closest to my values, because I think that we all can kind of come to the table and examine the accuracy and the rights of the Constitution as a starting point. As an American, here are our rights, regardless of what race, class, denominational barrier, or religion you are. Here's the first set of rights that you have. And I think that may be the first talking point. But what happens is sometimes we identify groups and we start social service programs and I don't think people understand that that money is coming from someone else. So we start kind of bickering between each other.
Yeah.
And you know, I think each other's rights extend to the tip of each other's nose.
Mm-hmm.
So would you agree that the Constitution and the basic rights of America would be a good starting point versus victimization?
Well, I think few people would choose victimization over, constitutional values as a starting point. So I think that's an easy question to answer. But if you want to dig in more honestly to the question, just because someone says something doesn't mean it is so. He talks about constitutional values. He talks about identity politics as being negative and victimology as being rampant. But then we don't see those constitutional values that treat everybody equally playing out in any actual policy or in any actual plan. So it remains just talk. And it goes for any politician, by the way. I voted for Obama twice. It doesn't mean I agree with so I just want to say that I take your admission at face value that while you voted for him, you don't support bigotry or discrimination, etc. That's not why you voted for him. You voted for other reasons. Great. I voted for Obama for certain reasons. His shortcomings, though, I then would be doubly responsible for speaking out against. You understand me? So if he does something along the lines of, for example, some of this drone warfare that targeted didn't target, but really cost tons of civilian lives because there was no risk to us. There were no pilots. It's like a computer game, essentially. Drones go out, they bomb things. Oh, it happened to be a school or a hospital. We thought it was a missile bank or factory, right? I have responsibility to speak out against that because I thought I was voting for an anti-war candidate. For example, I had certain values and they weren't met in the implementation. So what I say to you is it's fine that you voted for him. I don't think everybody who voted for Trump is a bigot. I never make that claim. But I say that should he actually then implement bigoted policies or continue in bigoted rhetoric, it would be incumbent upon those who supported him and empowered him in his position to doubly speak out with a sense of responsibility. I brought this guy in to say, I stand against that. And then, that's great. Then there's nothing on you. But if it's just kind of like, well, I voted for him for these values, but he does all these other things, well, it's not my fault, it's not my responsibility. That is a bit washing our hands away from responsibility as civic participants in this society, I think. And it's too easy to do. Now, to answer the other part of your question, we can't deny that there are entrenched attitudes towards certain people of certain profiles. Where they are systemized, for example, black men versus law enforcement, and how they're seen as a greater threat by virtue of being young black men in many parts of the country, regardless of what they do, right? We can deny that. We can assess that, but let's say the assessment is true, that we see data that suggests that there's a higher percentage of peaceful young black men without weapons who are targeted violently by the police than other people of other genders and races and ages. Then we need to ask the question, how much of this is systemized? And whether it's directly or indirectly, it may be indirectly if we don't challenge it. Meaning that if we just say, well, it's the way it is, then it is reinforced and it becomes indirectly. I'm not saying that someone said, sent an email, hey everybody, target young black, men in urban neighborhoods. But indirectly could be systemized in the sense that it was never challenged. And it was never parsed out. And it was never shown to people, including law enforcement, whom I assume are good people. They never had this moment when they look at the data. So by not doing that, we're indirectly systemizing it. So there has to be that challenge. Now, is that identity politics? Well, I'm sorry, but if there is identity profiling, I'm going to identity call it out. Go ahead.
First, I would like to say thank you very much for your presentation and being here with us and expose a lot of things that we were not aware of. Two things that I have actually to ask. First, yes, we do hear a lot of speeches and presentation defending Islam and Muslims and the reality that Muslims are not terrorists. But the minute we leave the hall and we go turn on CNN and something happened in Europe or in other part of the world, a Muslim had blown up himself and killed so many people. How do you come back again and defend the reality that there are Muslims outside, that there are Muslims, which is we as Muslims really understand for fact that they are not related to Islam. I know that for fact. How would you defend, or if I may use the word defend, this kind of acts? On the other part, the reality of the new era of Trump and the administration and the policy they are proceeding in this fact, is it going to make it much safer? Will that make United States and Americans safer here in the United States by banning Muslims from coming to the country?
Well, the data suggests no. But back to your first question, how do I explain it? Well, again, it's fine to discuss how bad of a trend of a phenomenon this is, to acknowledge the facts as they are. I'm not interested in whitewashing or denying anything that is true. But I'm very careful to have that debate outside of a referendum on me. That whatever the results of that debate, I'm not pulled into it as complicit or somehow a co-conspirator or someone that therefore should be okay with a backlash. Because oftentimes that's where the debate goes. So we have to be very clear from the beginning. Generalization is unacceptable. You, as a law-abiding, good person who had nothing to do with any of those acts, name them as you wish, Boston, San Bernardino, whatever, Europe, here or there, like everybody else in this audience, you learned about it from television. You were never consulted as a Muslim. You were never emailed or signed any papers. You never had any conversations with anybody saying it's okay. As a matter of fact, when you heard about it, your heart was broken doubly, once as a human like everybody else, and once as a Muslim who sees your faith dragged through the mud. So I don't want, when we start to begin to talk about the socio-political phenomenon that is religious extremism and terrorism, that somehow, the results of that somehow reflects on me as a person when I have nothing to do with it. How do I explain that? By putting the mirror back to the community that is potentially falling in that trap and saying, look, I could do this in the opposite direction, easily. Try it with any group. You can do it. You want to talk about building a case for Christian violence? It would be wrong to do. But one could wrongly do it. It's not for a lack of material. One could point to the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda today, not centuries ago, who is killing in the name of Christ. One can point to the extremist groups in Africa and Latin America who also do the same. One can point to the Inquisition a few centuries ago that skinned alive Jews and Muslims if they didn't convert to Christ. One can point to the worst cases of human death tolls anywhere in the planet in white-to-white wars, Christian-to-Christian wars in Europe. World War I was entirely essentially white Christian affair. So was World War II. One can point to the transatlantic slave trade. One can point to the lynchings of African Americans after Sunday church with Bible readings at the foot of the hill. One can point to the forced conversion of all the native tribes of Latin America into Catholicism in order to save them, and there was rape and death and destruction. One can point to all of that and build this idea of this age-old Christian militant violence that has taken over the world and given a name and bring experts on TV and let's fear every Christian in the audience, but it would be wrong because there's so many nuances in everything I just mentioned. The wars in Europe were not motivated by religion. In other instances, that were motivated by religion. It was that person's wicked heart that abused religion for their own political purposes. There's nothing that Jesus Christ said that suggests that you can kill natives in order to convert them, or that you should skin people in order for them to convert, or kill them, stone them alive, or whatever. So it's the same exact thing. If you can understand that, I expect you to understand that the reverse is also true and also problematic when it comes to Muslims. It's simply a question of, we're always in the defensive seat. We're always trying to explain ourselves out of a rut. But we're too polite to simply say, I'm sorry, but this can go either way. And I'm sorry, but it can. Now, you can study the Inquisition. It was terrible. You can study, that what's happening today with ISIS is terrible. But be careful about expecting me to accept your generalizations or your lazy intellectual conclusions, and therefore penalizing me and my family as a result of your lack of intellectual aptitude.
You talked about the white Appalachian worker, like in Wyoming or wherever. How do you expect to reach that that kind of person? Like you're centered mostly in Chicago and come around the university. Like how do you expect to get to that worker you talked about who is probably mostly isolated?
That's a very good question. As a matter of fact, I really don't most of the time. And again, I don't see myself as the solution to the problem, right? I have limited resources, limited geographical reach, and we work within our stated scope and mission. We have other offices in other parts of the country. They have it harder, where they have to reach out to communities that haven't traditionally interacted with Muslims, but the potential results are greater. So that work is very important. Now, in a perfect world, I'd love to have the resources and the ability to travel and engage everybody everywhere. But right now, the frank answer is we don't, and that's part of the problem. You had a question.
Thank you. That's a segue to my question. Given the name of the organization, C.A.I.R Chicago, do you focus primarily on Chicagoland, or you are open to other places in the state?
That's what I meant by
state?
Yes, we focus on Chicago, and when we extend ourselves, it's Illinois, the Midwest, at best, Wisconsin, Indiana, but really, that's it. I mean, we can talk about national issues that affect everybody equally, but in terms of the cases, they're very local. We had a question here in the middle.
Thank you. By the way, I think it was an excellent talk. I agree with pretty much everything that you say. But I think that one of the problems that we run into here is that, situations in the world are complicated. And everybody likes short, black and white solutions. As far as I can tell, Islamophobia wasn't really a big problem in the United States, any more so than, any other discrimination against immigrants, until the 1970s. When the Iranian Revolution happened and the Iranians took the Americans hostage. I come from New York City. I was in New York on September 11th. And I remember the New Yorker magazine came out a week later, and there was a piece in it by Susan Sontag, who's a famous philosopher and playwright and such. And the point that she made was, well, this is certainly a terrible thing, but we should stop and ask ourselves, what did we do to piss these guys off so much that they would do such a god-awful thing? And she was universally shouted down. It's not the time to talk about that. We have to come together. We're being attacked. I got all excited. There's a story, and it may be true, and it may not be true, but if it's not true, it ought to be. Someone once told me that John Foster Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, was talking to President Eisenhower. And he said, well, the Middle East is very important because there are all these resources there, oil and all the stuff that we need. And he says, well, we're going to have some problems there because the people in the Middle East don't look kindly on the United States. They see us as not supporting freedom and democracy for them. They see us as supporting dictatorial regimes. And Eisenhower said, well, what can we do to change that perception? He said, well, it's going to kind of be hard because it's true. The whole reason that the Iranians, took the Americans hostage was that Iran had a government that was going to be a socialist communist government, and they weren't going to have the same deal with the oil companies that they had before this. So the Western powers engineered a coup and installed the Shah. And the Shah, in some respects, did some good things, but he also had a very dictatorial regime. And when he got sick and he came to America, he left the country, he came here for cancer treatment, there was a revolution, and the people were justifiably annoyed at us because we had done this. If you look at what happened in Iraq, Saddam Hussein used to be our buddy. We sold him tons and tons of weapons. Why were they looking for weapons of mass destruction? Because we sold them to him so he could use them against the Iranians. So today, I don't know as really I think a lot of Americans wrongly believe that we're at war with the Islamic world. But the question, I don't think it's over a religious issue. I think we need to maybe stop and think about, what did we do to piss these guys off, that they're annoyed with us, that they would come, that they would drive trucks into crowds of people, that they would do all sorts of stuff like this. But no one wants to have that conversation.
Well, so you raised some excellent points, and I have to agree with you 1,000% on the first thing you said, which is up until the 1970s, Islamophobia was not necessarily a predominant phenomenon in America. It was part of the usual, you said it very well, mixture of xenophobia. It was right in there. But I couldn't say that a Muslim was more a target of xenophobia than a Hindu. As a matter of fact, we're probably confused together. And those were the good old days for us, right? It was just, generic racism, that's great. No, but it did start in the 70s, and it had to do with these incidents around the world. Now, before we get into who's at fault, it's important to emphasize the reason why Islamophobia comes in and why I think it's a problem, is that most Americans were introduced to Islam around the same time that they were introduced to radical, whether perceived or real, radical Muslims. So let's shelf the debate for just one moment on who's right and who's wrong in Iran and who did what. But whether real or unreal, the perception was these are radicals, doing radical things on TV, burning things, jumping up and down, have hairy faces, mouths open, scary images. And that was around the same time most Americans began to learn about Islam. And then there was the Salman Rushdie affair, this British writer of Muslim origin who wrote a book. The new regime in Iran didn't like it. There was a death sentence against him, book burnings, all of that was on television. Then there was the American flag burnings, for reasons you mentioned, whatever, on television. And then Islam was in the background. And then you get into the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War and 9/11 and everything else, Al-Qaeda, now ISIS. So I call this sort of like, the series of unfortunate incidents that happened one after another. And every time Americans were introduced to Islam through that singular lens. Now, Islam, of course, didn't begin in the 1970s. Islam was around since, forever, since the year 610 AD. But it wasn't until then. So when you have that, let's call it associative relationship between one negative thing and Islam as a whole, it's no wonder that there has been this aversion developed against Islam and Muslims. So that's one point.
That's not my point. My point is that we need to sort of examine what are the roots of this conflict that we sit ourselves in.
And that's what I'll get to next. But I just wanted to make this point clearly, because that's where I agree with you, but I want to take it further to explain part of the reason why Islamophobia is here is because Islam is almost always entering into our psyche through international crises. Whereas it doesn't exist as a result of them, it exists before, after, during, and everywhere, right? So we're missing, again, a huge part of the story of what Islam is, and so we have this very limited view. But to get to the second point, what you say is true about American complicity, and again, regardless of assigning blame. However, it's also true to your question is why they dislike us. It's also true that they don't dislike us. If they is defined clearly, because they is often undefined, to include this massive thing that can never be assigned to a singular pronoun, but let's just do it, that is the Muslim world, or even the Arab world for that matter. And I'll give you proof that they don't dislike us. Now imagine if the United States, if in America, we had a falafel shop at every corner of every major city, that we had all these fashion houses that were spending millions of dollars to announce the new line of jilbabs and whatever other types of Arabian clothing exist, turbans and things like that. That we had Arab movies blasting at every local cinema, and that we were listening to Arabic songs in our cars every day. Could you make a case that we hate Arabs or Islam or Muslims? The reverse is true. If you were to go to Dubai or Lebanon or Syria or Egypt or any of those countries, you'll find that there is a very strong tolerance, if not admiration, for things that are American, culturally, etc., historically. The food, the clothing, movies, songs. So it's really difficult to make the claim that they hate us when they tolerate and even consume so much of us, almost subconsciously and willingly. So we have to then pinpoint where the dislike comes and where it's coming from. So in the case of Iran, it was a political regime and a student group that was reacting to their own challenges that we assisted, and that's where that came from. In the case of other groups, there are other history and other local concerns, but we can't even then say they as in everybody, because it's just not true.
But I guess the point I want to make, though, is the lie that was fed to us, that is fed to us, is they hate us because we're free.
Right.
As though Osama bin Laden was annoyed I was eating a ham sandwich, drinking a beer, reading a Playboy magazine. I don't think they care about that. I think they care about how we've been.
We agree, but I just want to summarize it in two very short points. One, first of all, they don't all hate us, so the statement is wrong. Secondly, those who do have their reasons. Some are valid, some are invalid. Some actually do because they're just haters. But some have reasons, okay? Some have reasons like bombs. I mean, today I think one of the largest non-nuclear bomb ever was dropped on Afghanistan. Now, that's the story we hear. Very few people are going to be asking, wait, what's next? How many people died? Where exactly? What did it feel like for the local villagers? That part of the story, it's done. It's been dropped. The answer to the question, where is Afghanistan? Hey, that's a place where you drop bombs. What's the problem? Right? It's not Belgium. It's Afghanistan. It's made to be a crapshoot of bombs, so whatever. But people there still think they're people, and they still react. So if there's hate developed as a result, it's not so surprising.
If I can simplify the question, can you agree with the grievances that ISIS has, but disagree with the tactics?
No, ISIS is so off the mark, and so... and Al-Qaeda and all of these groups. I have no sympathy for these groups. I'm not saying this to deflect, I'm a good Muslim, but there are valid concerns and valid grievances in the Muslim world amongst the mainstream populations who never think ever to resort to this anti-Muslim, devilish, demonic behavior, violence that is terrorism. Okay, they have concerns with the promotion of dictatorships, with propping up dictators, with stealing resources, with hoodwinking populations, all of that stuff. Valid concerns. Never resort to terrorism. So, no, I don't think they have any valid concerns or valid reasons for what they do. I think they actually want to dominate with their own ideology. I think actually they have a very narrow ideology that doesn't just hate the West, frankly, but as you mentioned earlier, hates Muslims even more. Muslims have been victims of ISIS much, much more than Christians or Jews or anybody else. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Keeping aside like all the negativity, I'm thinking about like some positive things here. Like what I go by is like Allah says that when you lose something in life, you gain something. Like He will replace it with something that you can own in life. And so my question is your organization starting any campaigns that have any messages towards peace, like peace and love and just like stuff like that? Are you starting anything like that?
I mean, it's not an interfaith organization. I don't want to just give you a nice answer. Like, we are in the trenches and we work to fight against some very difficult opponents who spend millions of dollars to put down the cases that we bring up that are around social justice for people that can't afford it. So there are other groups that do this sort of thing. Now, of course, in our... Yeah, I mean, it's part of our culture as an organization. So when we're engaging other groups or the public or Muslims, we're always focusing on the alternative as the better way, which is love, which is peace, which is understanding, which is tolerance, which is even more than that, acceptance and understanding one another, seeing each other in the mirror. That's very much part of how we see the world. And we're fighting against the opposite of that, to get to that. So that's definitely there, but do we, run events around that all the time? Not really. My jihad was one way publicly, but our main work is in fighting against the lack of that. You had a question in the front, sir. We can conclude with you because you had your hand up.
As the election unfolded, there was a perception that that Trump opened up an abscess that was always there and allowed that abscess to come out publicly in discrimination. Is there any empirical evidence that you have that the election of Trump, the campaign of Trump, has increased the pressure of discrimination?
Yes, so much as you can have in 72 days or so. Or 2 years. Well, since the right, correct. So if you go that far back, we have seen an uptick in reports to our office in the cases reported, in terms of people in public transportation, attacks, violent attacks in the public domain, malls, streets, etc., bullying in schools, and cases of discrimination reported to our office of the usual kind. We've seen an uptick in those types of cases. And I have to say, it's not unique to Trump in the sense that when we had other politicians also engaging in Islamophobic rhetoric publicly and casting a light of suspicion on Muslims as a whole and Islam as a whole, we would see trends that matched that rhetoric. So we saw that from certain politicians in Illinois, when we had a certain congressman who's no longer a congressman suggest that Muslim terrorists were embedded in our communities. In Naperville, he named communities. We saw attacks against mosques right in those communities. And of course, there was no evidence to what he was saying. It's not even true, but it was true that there was an uptick in attacks. As a result, we have empirical evidence for that. So it's not the first time, and we're not surprised, actually. It tends to follow. That's why we say politicians and elected officials have to practice responsibility. We're not saying be nice to us, just be responsible in your words. Trump said Islam hates us. How can you how can you even explain that sentence? Islam is not a person.
We're going to need to stop there. We're already over.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Couple of very quick announcements. First, there's excellent Afghani food. Please stay for the food. It's wonderful. There are 2 stations, so please be a little bit organized. Secondly, Ahmad is going to be giving the khutbah, which is the Friday sermon, tomorrow at the mosque, which is located at 3000 Stanton Street. And if you're interested in attending the mosque, there's 25 students from Lincoln Land. Professor Berryman is here from Lincoln Land. If you'd like to join us, please let me know and we can make the arrangements. It's 3000 Stanton Street, but do give us your names so that we can make the proper arrangements. Thank you so much for coming. Take care.